Okay, so some of my thoughts on the poly hopper spreaders by Douglas Dynamics, like the Fisher Polycaster, the Western Tornado, probably some Snow X stuff. Electric motor driven spinner. These things are put together a little bit on the shoddy side. Anyway, so when you buy these, it's very possible that the belt alignment is not exactly as good as it could be. There's a few kind of moving parts that you got to keep in mind in here, and it, depending on how it was put together, can make a difference between how many problems you have and downtime in the future. So this pulley here, I believe it's a 10 tooth. There's a set screw, and I think there's a flat on the motor shaft. It's like a 1/2 inch shaft. This is kind of adjustable up and down. There's no like hole where the set screw ends up. So the height of this can change the happiness of your belt. Now this pulley, although it's not adjustable on the shaft per se, let's get to the set screw here, right there. So the shaft itself, as far as I can think of, only has 2 holes in it. There's a hole at this end where that set screw goes in. So the pulley in relation to the shaft is fixed. In other words, it's not adjustable. You can't move it up and down, kind of like you can here on the small one. But with that said, this entire shaft, so you got a pillow block bearing here, and you got a pillow block bearing underneath. The only thing that holds the shaft's basically floating in there. The only thing that holds it in place from, like, essentially, you know, imagine if there was a hole in my plywood here and the spinner wasn't on. The only thing that could keep that thing from falling right out is there's 2 set screws on the bearing that just kind of pinches the inner race to the shaft. So when you put this thing together, the height of where you decide to set your set screws to pinch it on the bottom and the top is what's going to give you the height of this bigger pulley. With that said, the tensioner here is kind of a fixed deal in that, you know, it's spring loaded, but it's got nowhere to go. You see there's a bolt head there, and it's kind of like rubbing against the plate. So I think everything for the belt pulley alignment should be based off kind of the center of your tensioner. So you want to set your motor 10 tooth gear, you know, to ride halfway through this, and then you make this match so that it's happy to where when you're turning it, the belt ends up in the center of the pulley, and it's not rubbing up against one of the sheaves like mine was. When I bought it, you could hear it was making like a rubber noise, and it was on this, and then that extra friction causes heat, and that can lead to premature belt failure. See how my belt's all cracked here? So that's something to keep an eye on. So once you're, you know, done replacing parts, or if you just bought the thing. Now I'll say this one is, I don't know if it's like a 2019 model. So the hopper itself is of the newer mold. You see below where my light is right there. The older ones were molded differently. So it's a rather new unit, but the newest units, the spinner assembly is covered. This is all molded black. See, I have just a plastic cover that goes over here. It's right there on the floor. But the newer ones, this is all encapsulated. And essentially, I think this plate, which it might be a little bit different design, but it just bolts in from the bottom. So my problem with this is I was getting, you know, aside from hearing it that it was unhappy, I was getting a CP code, which is chute present, which is kind of a weird code. It could send you on a wild goose chase, I think, because chute present, if you look it up, has something to do with a magnet not being recognized, whatever, which I think was only a thing on the steel casters. The poly versions don't have that. So I think what happens is the electric motor, which is controlled by the module in the hopper, the electronics in the back, that senses current. And if the current's too low or the current's too high, it'll set a code, which is possibly the CP code. Now, this one's a few years old, and I noticed at the beginning of this season here, when I went to go turn this, it was kind of a little bit on the hard to turn side, even though I've always kept things greased. And from what I've found out, with my little bit of experience with bearings, the pillow block bearings that Fisher, Western, Douglas Dynamics, whoever, puts in these things uses a steel shield. Now, steel shields are cool in like basically a no dust environment. And steel shields are usually used for like a very high RPM. If you have a bearing in a high RPM application, the rubber seal version has too much friction on the bearing surface and you can melt all the grease out. So like a rubber seal bearing version versus the steel will have a lower RPM rating. With that said, this spinner doesn't spin anywhere near what you would call high RPM. So it's not a thing. What I found online is, so this is my lower bearing. Obviously the lower bearing is going to have many more problems than the upper bearing. They're both the same part number. But just the fact that the lower bearing is down by the ground, and then, depending on where the height that you have your spinner set, sand or sand salt comes down, or salt comes down, gravity hits this and you get sand, salt, you get road grime kicking up underneath, getting to that lower bearing. And even if you keep it greased, the steel shield just really sucks at holding in grease, and it basically doesn't keep dust or salt out whatsoever, so shit gets in there and it ruins the bearing. So I bought some aftermarket bearings that have dual seals, and they're rubber seals, so they're going to hold grease in much better, and they're going to keep all the foreign junk out, dust, sand, salt, whatever. Another thing too is in the off season, if you take your spinner assembly here and you just leave it on the ground, the moisture coming off the ground will start to wear that bearing. And you can see mine, even though after greasing it, it spun pretty well, but I can tell it was a little bit noisy. Look, the seal all fell apart. You can see the bearings in there. Now the upper one, because it's all encased and it's up here, it's gonna wear way slower, but I replaced them both with the better version. And it's all pretty simple. I mean, you take off your belt, you can get the tensioner out of here, because if you leave the tensioner there, when you pull the shaft and this pulley off and you're working on it, this can like move over, and then when you go to put your shaft through, you're gonna have to take this apart. I think this is a 3/16 Allen, 1/2-inch nut. This is like a shouldered bolt. All the other Allen screws are, I believe they're 1/8 inch. So there's one here, there's 2 on this set screw, there's 2 on this set screw in the bottom. I never had to remove the spinner. I always just left it on there. But yeah, I'm trying to think of anything else to help people. But pretty straightforward. It's just, 9/16, 2 bolts. They're just carriage bolts that holds it into the plate. And when you take this apart, take some like fine grit sandpaper or some like 3M Scotch pad, clean it up real well, grease both the shaft and the inside, the inner race of the bearing on the inside where it slides on. So if you ever want to take this apart again, you'll have no issues. And so basically, you take that set screw out. This just comes right off the shaft. And then in order to lower everything, so like I said on the other ones, this is all encapsulated, so you'll just pull a bunch of bolts out, I think, or nuts, and it'll all want to slide off. But first you got to take off, you know, 1, 2, 3, and then it's symmetrical, so the same 3 on the other side. And then you got that center one, and then everything will just want to come right out of it, and then it's pretty simple to replace the bearings from there and just reverse, put it back together. And keep in mind when you tighten these bolts up, you just have kind of like a nylock, or not a nylock, but a like a riv nut molded into the plastic, and you don't want to put a bunch of torque on that. So just snugged past your lock washer, flattening out, and same. So these are like molded in riv nuts. These here are like well nuts. It's like a rubber. Hope this helps some people, because I didn't see anything online about changing bearings in these units, and there's no information about how horribly these belts are aligned. See how mine's riding right in the middle? You can see the tooth of the gear above and below. That's where you want it, so she's nice and happy. And another thing too, I'll always say it, but something that's retarded that they do is they tell you to store these off-season standing up on the back, and you put your wiring harness in here. You're thinking, oh, I took care of my wiring harness. Well, guess what? Water and moisture get in there, and over the entire spring, summer, and fall, that's just filling up with crap, and the moisture gets in there and it ruins your wiring. So you got to either not use this, just get a different piece of rubber and attach it to your harness, or clock this 90 either way. Mine is set up a little bit differently because I have it set for a mid-height position. I don't have an adjustable chute anymore. I don't see the point of having it adjustable. It's something I just set and forget. Hope that helps people. Belt's not super happy. The alignment, I believe that's a 10 tooth gear on the motor. And where it comes off the motor, looks like the motor is lower. Than this sprocket here. So the belt's rubbing on the bottom edge. What happens is, like what kills belts typically is heat and or ultraviolet rays. This never sees ultraviolet rays because it's always covered, it's always enclosed. So getting cracked like that, obviously rubber cracks as it ages, but I think it has something to do with the belt heating up also. Excess friction from, you hear that? The belt's trying to do funny stuff. So I think, okay, so you saw where my mark was on the shaft of the motor. I went all the way up to the mark. So now you look at the driven here. See how she's driving in the middle of the sheave? Can you hear how much happier the belt is? I'm guessing that happiness is going to result in cooler belt temperatures, so that belt won't dry rot so fast, and you'll have less friction, so the motor will drive easier, it'll draw less amperage. It rides right in the center of the tensioner pulley. So all I did was loosen that set screw. Now I've had this apart before, just to take that set screw out and grease it up and then put it back in. So if you're gonna start loosening that up, I'd pull it right out and add some grease to it so that it doesn't seize. So if you ever change a motor, although some motors come with the gear, but anyway. Actually, yeah, you gotta pull that off to get the motor out of the plate. But all I did was loosen that set screw, which is a 1/8 inch Allen. And just be careful when you retorque it. It doesn't take very much pressure to put that on there. I'm assuming the motor has like a flat on it. So not much needed, but that's it. much happier. Just so you can hear what my, now that it's greased after sitting all summer, you know, in the fall I greased it when I put it on the truck. She was a little stiff and now she turns. But you can hear how growly that bearing is. And I think Douglas Dynamics uses single seal bearings. It just doesn't hold the grease in well, doesn't keep the foreign materials, grime, whatever, road grime and sand and salt out very well. And this is one of those things, like, yeah, it spins okay. Can I get by longer? This is the type of stuff you want to take apart ahead of time because stuff gets seized all together. You know, steel bearing surfaces and steel races and steel shafts. And I mean, obviously that shaft is not stainless steel. Look how it's rusting. I'm gonna assume that the upper bearing lasts a much longer time because it doesn't see the gravity of salt, and then it doesn't hang out the bottom to get salt spray as you're driving around. You know, it's covered up top, but I want to change them as a max repair because I'm a psycho and I just want everything to work as good as possible. So we're going to install these dual seal new bearings. I've never done it before. I've never seen any videos or anything, so I'm figuring as I go along, and I'll update with some instructions. Okay, so I got her apart. So the upper bearing got 2 carriage bolts, the nuts, and then there's 2 lock washers, 14 millimeters, 9/16. And then there's the, so you want to take the belt off, and that's just a matter of, this is swung in position, just taking like a pair of side cutters, dikes, just removing the spring, move that aside, take the belt off. Fit in the newer ones without the plastic cover. This is all kind of enclosed. You would just take the nuts off or whatever and prepare for everything to slide out the bottom, which is just a matter of removing bolt here, bolt here, bolt here, bolt there, the 2 other ones on the side, and then there's a center one up here. And these side ones are longer. They look like they're all like 3/8 bolts. So these go on the side, just on the side of the chute. And these are your other 2 on the far side, 2 on the far other side, and 1 in the center. And those are also all 14 millimeter or 9/16. Once you do that, you can get the guard / whatever out of the way, and everything just slides out. I was able to take my hammer and just slide that bearing off, bang, 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 both sides, so you're not caulking it on the shaft, which is right there. Looks horrible. The bottom one's a little bit more of a bitch, and I didn't want to deal with the spinner, even though I believe I've taken that apart before and greased it up, but no need. So I just took the bearing and I sandwiched it in my vise. I have a press in the other room, but I wasn't going to mess with that. So I just put the bearing here in the vise, and very carefully with an air hammer with a blunt end, and you want to stay in the middle of your shaft because you don't want to mushroom the shaft, because then you'll have a hard time getting it off, and then you'll have to grind the damaged end of the shaft in order to get the new bearing on. But if you stay right in the center of the shaft, you won't damage anything. I just pushed it right out. I suggest cleaning everything up very well and greasing things so that if you ever need to pull it back apart, it actually comes back apart. I'm gonna put some new bearings on it. Okay, things are just put together loosely. Each bearing has 2 set screws. See a set screw right there. And you see one coming out the side right there. I pull those out and grease them up, or anti-seize. And then the same thing with the top one. I pulled them out. So I grease the shafts, then I grease the inside of the bearing race on the inside where the shaft goes through. And then, so I'm just gonna slide this up on top and put this, what I'll just call the guts, back inside and bolt everything up.